The harbor at La Rochelle is quiet. It should be quiet. It is past midnight, and the city sleeps. But in the darkness between the stone docks and the open Atlantic, 18 heavy warships are being loaded in absolute silence. No torches, no shouted orders. Men who have spent decades protecting the most powerful military institution in the medieval world move with the kind of precision that only comes from years of operating in the dark. They load crates whose contents no official record will ever describe. By dawn, every ship is gone. By dawn, the King of France will send soldiers to arrest every member of the order within his reach. The charges are prepared, the cells are ready, but the fleet and the 15,000 warriors who were not standing in French commanderies when the doors came down have ceased to exist. No wreckage, no bodies, no record of arrival on any Atlantic coast. 18 warships do not vanish. You cannot hide 18 warships. And yet, that single night is not an accident. It is a signature. The same signature appears across 4,000 years of military history. From the banks of the Orontes River to the foothills of Afghanistan, from the frozen halls of Constantinople to the burning plains of Mesopotamia. The pattern is always identical. An elite force grows precise enough, dangerous enough, irreplaceable enough, and then, without warning, the records go quiet. The names disappear. The victories are reassigned to gods, to fate, to anonymous soldiers carrying no unit designation. This is not the story of warriors who fell on the battlefield. Defeat leaves bodies. It leaves mass graves and enemy accounts and broken standards. What we are about to examine leaves nothing. A deliberate, systematic erasure of the most effective military forces in human history, beginning at the exact moment when those forces became too valuable to reward and too dangerous to release. 10 cases, 4,000 years, one mechanism. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Within 2 centuries of their founding, they were richer than the French crown, and on that October night in 1307, they sailed. Not scattered, not destroyed, sailed. The order's stated purpose was the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. That was the story distributed to the public. The actual function was something no church document formally acknowledged. The Knights Templar had invented the first coded international banking system in human history. A merchant in London could deposit silver at a Templar commandery, receive an encrypted letter, and withdraw its equivalent value, an acre, without carrying a single coin across roads that would otherwise guarantee his robbery and death. The letters used a cryptographic cipher the order never published. The system predated modern banking by 6 centuries. By the early 14th century, the order operated 15,000 commanderies across Europe. It held the personal debt papers of every major crown on the continent. Philip IV of France was indebted to the Templars for sums he could not repay in his lifetime. The arrests, the manufactured charges of heresy, the 7-year show trial, the eventual burning of Grand Master Jacques de Molay in 1314, these were not acts of religious justice. They were debt cancellation with a theatrical justification. The charges were absurd. The confessions were extracted under torture. A papal commission reviewing the evidence in 1308 concluded privately that most accusations were groundless. The papal bull, officially dissolving the order, was issued 3 years later, under the direct military pressure of a French army camped outside the council where it was signed. None of this was hidden. It was simply not the part that was supposed to matter. What mattered was the fleet. 18 ships departed La Rochelle in the hours before the arrests. No cargo manifest was filed. No destination was logged. The French investigation noted the departure and then stopped noting it. No intercepted vessel, no seized documents, no gold recovered. Within a decade, the Order of Christ appeared in Portugal, staffed by former Templar knights. In Scotland, a period coinciding with the fugitive fleet saw the sudden appearance of highly trained cavalry at Bannockburn, whose maneuvers broke English heavy horse in ways no Scottish commander had demonstrated before. No charges were filed against any of these men. No ships were ever found. The King of France canceled his debts. The archives burned. What matters is not where 18 warships went. What matters is that a state willing to arrest thousands of men simultaneously, willing to maintain a 7-year show trial, willing to burn its own Grand Master in public, that state filed one administrative note about a departing fleet and then stopped looking. The investigation ended at the waterline. And an investigation that stops exactly where the most valuable assets were last seen is not an investigation, it is a boundary. Officially, There is nothing to see here, officially. 3,000 miles east, and 19 centuries earlier, a Persian emperor solved a different problem. Not how to hide an army, how to make one seem impossible to kill. The soldiers you are about to hear about were never fewer than 10,000. Never more than 10,000. In every campaign account, every diplomatic intelligence report gathered by Greek agents operating inside the Achaemenid court, the number is always identical. A soldier falls in battle. Before the next morning's muster, the gap is closed. Herodotus named them the Athanatoi, the Immortals. The glazed brick friezes from the palace of Darius I at Susa, fragments of which now sit in the Louvre in Paris, show them in extraordinary detail. Scale armor worn beneath richly embroidered court robes, short spears with counterweights cast in the shape of golden pomegranates, wicker shields that concealed a second defensive layer underneath. The inner 1,000 wore gold ornaments, the outer 9,000 wore silver. The distinction was visible from 200 meters. This was not vanity, it was a communication system. They were meant to be read as a single mechanism, not as 9,000 individual men. Wouter Henkelmann at the Collège de France published analysis in 2017 of the Persepolis Fortification Archive, clay tablets recording grain and livestock rations distributed across the Achaemenid imperial administration. The tablets show provisioning orders for units that carry no designation in any official battle order, rations dispersed, no unit name attached, no commander listed. In other words, food is being delivered to soldiers who officially do not exist. The mainstream interpretation is administrative overlap, that accounting categories in the Achaemenid system did not map cleanly onto military categories. That is reasonable. It works as an explanation until you confront the logistics of what the Immortals actually required to function as described. Replacing a battle casualty in an ancient army took weeks at minimum. The replacement had to march from a home province, be equipped, be integrated into formation. The Immortals never showed a gap, not during the siege of Babylon, not in the Egyptian campaigns, not at Thermopylae, where they fought in rotation for 3 days. What this system required, physically, is a shadow corps, a parallel force of trained, equipped, ready to deploy soldiers moving alongside the main column, but never entering the official count. A reserve whose only function was to be invisible until needed. For the 6th century before the Common Era, that is not a logistical adjustment. It is a bureaucratic technology without parallel in the ancient world. And here is the detail that does not fit the administrative overlap theory. The tablets Henkelmann analyzed are provisioning records. They record what was consumed. An accounting gap in a category label would produce irregular or inconsistent ration entries. What the tablets show is consistent, recurring provisioning at specific intervals, with no unit designation attached. That is not a clerical error pattern. That is a deliberate omission pattern. Someone was feeding these men. Someone decided their name should not appear beside the food. The Achaemenid Empire did not merely have an elite guard. It had what we would now call a pre-positioned rapid deployment reserve, one so precisely maintained that no external observer ever documented its existence. The friezes in Susa show the Immortals as they appeared to foreign envoys. What moved behind them has left no portrait. What if the real invention was not the warriors themselves, but the invisible system that replenished them? What if the first standing military reserve in history was designed to be undetectable, and succeeded so thoroughly that we are still arguing about whether it existed? A workman in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, turns up a silver medallion in the soil. The year is 1866. On the medallion, stamped in clean Latin, Leg Hisp 9, 9th Hispana Legion. He does not know what he is holding. He sells it to an antiquary. It ends up in a collection. Decades later, a military historian picks it up and goes very still. The last confirmed record of the 9th Legion inside Britain is a building inscription from York, dated 108 of the Common Era. The Legion was repairing a gate, standard maintenance. Their stonecutters left their mark on the threshold lintel. Then nothing. Not a battle account, not a transfer order, not a discharge registry, not a mass burial. In the comprehensive military rolls compiled under Emperor Antoninus Pius around 165 of the Common Era, the 9th Legion is absent. 5,000 heavy infantry, engineers, cavalry auxiliaries, administrative staff. A fully functional Roman military organism simply ceases to appear in the most bureaucratically precise record-keeping system the ancient world produced. Lawrence Keppie, at the University of Glasgow, spent decades cataloging every extant inscription associated with the ninth. The map he assembled is a map of absence, York through 108, a possible officer inscription from Nijmegen, datable to the 130s. Then, an archival wall, the kind that does not show up on any physical map. The popular explanation is Scotland. The ninth marched north into Pictish territory, was ambushed, and was destroyed so completely that Rome preferred silence to explanation. It is a story that satisfies, because it has the shape of tragedy. It has also left no material evidence whatsoever. No mass burial site corresponding to 5,000 men has been identified in Scotland. No battle scatter of Roman military equipment dated to the relevant period has been excavated north of Hadrian's Wall. The Picts of that era did not have the tactical infrastructure to annihilate a full legion without leaving any trace in the ground. The Nijmegen medallion does not fit the Scotland theory at all. If the legion was destroyed around 120, the medallion should not exist 20 years later in the Netherlands. Epigrapher Anthony Burley at the University of Dusseldorf identified an officer named Lucius Aemilius Carus, commanding a unit designated as the Ninth, in Arabia, around 130. His appointment is documented. His rank is documented. His unit disappears from the record shortly after his posting. The Damnatio Memoriae, the Roman legal instrument by which an emperor, senator, or institution was formally excised from the historical record, was not typically applied to military units. The fact that no dissolution decree for the Ninth has been found is not evidence of routine decommissioning. In Roman administrative practice, every unit retired by official order left a paper trail. The gap between 108 and 165 is not empty. It is structured. Roman administrative archives were meticulous. They recorded decommissioned units, transferred units, destroyed units. The absence of any such record for the Ninth is not the same as the absence of an ending. In Roman practice, the ending happened first. The paperwork followed. Here, neither the ending nor the paperwork has been found. What that gap looks like, under careful examination, is not a missing record. It is a removed one. A competent investigator learns to distinguish between those two things. Absence says something was lost. Removal says someone decided it should not be found. The Ninth did not lose its ending. Its ending was managed. In the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, in the southeastern gallery overlooking the nave, there is a stone railing worn smooth by centuries of hands. Carved into the marble beside it, in letters that required a blade and patience, are two words in Old Norse. Halfdan was here. A Norse warrior scratched his name into the greatest church in the medieval world. He was not a tourist. He was on duty. The Varangian Guard was created in 988 when Vladimir of Kiev sent 6,000 Norse fighting men to the Byzantine Emperor Basil II as payment for a dynastic alliance. What Basil received was more valuable than he had negotiated. These men spoke no Greek. They had no connection to Byzantine court factions, no family interests in palace politics, no debt relationships with the aristocracy that was constantly attempting to replace him. They were incorruptible by the specific mechanics of Constantinople, because corruption required fluency in a language they did not speak. Within a generation, they were the only armed force permitted in the immediate presence of the emperor. They held the keys to the treasury vaults. They guarded the doors to the imperial archive rooms. When an emperor died, the guard exercised the traditional right to Polutasvarf, a ritual plundering of the palace chambers, every man taking as much gold as he could physically carry without assistance. They were paid in secrets and gold. They kept both. Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, served as Akalithos, commander of the guard, in the 1040s. He dispatched enough gold from Constantinople to the north that upon his return to Scandinavia, he was able to purchase the Norwegian throne. Not inherit it, not seize it, purchase it. One man's salary from guarding a Byzantine emperor was sufficient to buy a kingdom. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the composition of the guard shifted permanently. Thousands of displaced Anglo-Saxon warriors, men who had lost their estates and their king at Hastings, sailed east and enlisted in Constantinople. They brought with them a specific, focused hatred of Norman France. The Byzantines found this professionally useful for the next century, and here is where this connects to the Templar fleet. Both institutions guarded not just physical bodies, but access, to money, to records, to the administrative infrastructure of imperial power. Both disappeared when the systems they guarded collapsed. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. The last confirmed action of the Guard is the defense of the Blachernae Palace Gate. After that, 6,000 professional warriors vanish from every chronicle simultaneously. They did not all die at that gate. The documented accounts of the sack describe a city in chaos, not a systematic execution. 6,000 trained soldiers, choosing to leave, could have left. What left that city with them is something no chronicle records. The Guard had held physical access to the treasury, the archive rooms, the operational manuals for imperial administration, for 2 centuries. Men who held those keys for that long do not simply become refugees. The question official histories never pursue is not where they went. It is what institutional knowledge travels with a professional force when the institution that employed them ceases to exist. Halfdan's name is still in the marble. He carved it during a shift that, for the Guard as an institution, was the last one. The rune is not a mystery, it is a timestamp. What we do not have is what came after it, which is exactly the kind of gap that, in this investigation, has started to feel less like accident and more like policy. You are standing on the banks of the Orontes River in what is now Syria. The month is May. The year is 1274 before the Common Era. The Egyptian army is falling apart around you. The chariot corps of the Hittite king has broken through the division of Ra. The camp is being looted. The pharaoh's personal escort has been cut down to almost nothing. Every calculation made before this campaign, the intelligence assessments, the troop estimates, the tactical models, has been wrong. The most powerful ruler in the ancient world is about to die in a ditch beside a Syrian river. And then, from the north, without prior indication, a column arrives. They strike the Hittites from the flank, while the Hittite warriors are occupied with the captured supplies. The timing is exact. The angle is optimal. Within hours, what had been a catastrophic defeat becomes a negotiated draw, the first formal peace treaty documented in human history. Alan Gardner at Oxford spent decades analyzing the inscriptions of Kadesh, preserved on temple walls across Egypt. He identified that the force arriving from the north had been dispatched by Ramses himself several days before the battle, sent along the Amorite coast on what appeared to be a maritime security mission. They were operating entirely outside the 4-division structure, the divisions of Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, that defined every documented Egyptian military engagement of the era. In the reliefs carved into the walls of the Ramesseum at Luxor, they are labeled the Nearin, the young ones, their ethnic designation, their unit origin, their commanding officers. None of this is recorded. The Hittite records from the same battle, preserved in the Bogazkoy archive, describe the engagement in considerable detail. The Nearin are not mentioned once. 500 men, at minimum, executed a flank attack that changed the outcome of the largest chariot battle in recorded history. The Hittite scribes either did not know who hit them or chose not to say. After Kadesh, the Nearin disappear from every record simultaneously. The battle ended in the documented draw. The subsequent diplomatic correspondence between Ramses and the Hittite king Hattusili III accounts for every major unit that participated, except one. Ramses spent the following 15 years carving his version of Kadesh into stone across Egypt: the temple at Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, Karnak, Luxor. In every version, his survival is attributed to the direct intervention of the god Amun, a divine miracle. A deity reached down and turned the battle. The men who actually turned the battle were not given an inscription. Their names were stripped from the official record. Their commander was not honored. The force that saved the pharaoh's life was written out of the pharaoh's life story, so that the pharaoh's divine nature, his claim to be the son of Ra, protected by the gods, could remain intact. The Nearin saved him. He repaid them with absence. A single word disappears from the administrative record of an empire, and a 1,000-year institution ceases to exist. That is what happened. From the time of the Old Kingdom, roughly 2400 before the Common Era, the Magi served as the policing and border security arm of the Egyptian state. They originated as Nubian trackers, brought in for their knowledge of desert terrain. They knew every water source across the eastern and western deserts. They knew which passes through the limestone hills were passable in summer, and which were lethal in winter. They controlled physical access to the gold mines that financed the entire pharaonic economy. Over centuries, the Medjay were so thoroughly integrated into Egyptian civil administration that the word itself became the standard Egyptian term for police. Papyri from Deir el-Medina, the administrative records of the royal tomb builders village at Luxor, studied extensively by Penelope Wilson at Durham University, document Medjay officers with authority to enter any room in the royal complex. Any room, including the preparation chambers, including the map rooms where the routes to the royal tombs were kept. They were the only institution that knew all three things simultaneously: the locations of the tombs, the routes through the desert to reach them, and the identities of every threat operating in the region. For 1,000 years, the pharaoh's treasures were intact, in part because these men existed. And here is where the Nearine connection closes the loop. Both institutions served pharaohs who needed their capabilities and feared the implications of acknowledging them. The Nearine were erased from a single battle. The Medjay were erased from an entire administrative category. At the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1070 before the Common Era, the word vanishes from the official record, not gradually. Within a single administrative cycle, one season it appears in routine documents. The next season it does not. In precisely that period, the royal tombs were systematically looted for the first time in Egyptian history. The high priests of Amun undertook an emergency program of relocating royal mummies to a hidden deposit, the cache later discovered at Deir el-Bahri in 1881, containing the preserved bodies of dozens of pharaohs, including Ramses II himself. The Medjay should have been preventing that crisis. They had done exactly that for 1,000 years. Where were they? The institution that held the access codes to everything disappeared at the exact moment when everything started to be stolen. That is either the largest coincidence in Egyptian administrative history, or it is an explanation. I have been trained to prefer coincidence until the evidence rules it out. I am still looking for the evidence that rules it out. They never lost a battle. Not one. Not a skirmish. Not a rearguard action. Not a desperate holding engagement at the end of a losing campaign. In 40 years of continuous fighting across 3 continents, the Silver Shields, the Argoraspids, were undefeated. This is why they had to die. They were veterans of Alexander the Great's campaigns, men who had marched from Macedonia to the borders of India and back. The youngest among them, when Alexander died in 323 before the Common Era, was in his late 40s. The senior warriors were in their 60s and 70s. Diodorus of Sicily noted that they moved with an efficiency younger troops could not replicate, because 4 decades had compressed every combat skill to the level of reflex. Their shields were plated with silver, a mark of personal honor granted by Alexander. Every general in the wars that followed Alexander's death understood what those shields meant. A force carrying them had never been stopped. After Alexander died, the Argoraspids supported the general Eumenes, a Greek by birth in a political world where Macedonian blood was the only legitimate currency. Under Eumenes, they kept winning. They always won. At Gabiene in 316 before the Common Era, they won again. But their opponent, the general Antigonus, had captured their baggage train. 4 decades of accumulated possessions, their families, their children, their gold, everything they owned from every campaign they had ever fought. Antigonus offered a deal: hand over Eumenes, receive the baggage. They handed him over. Their commander, the man who had led them to every victory. They delivered him in chains and watched him executed. Then they reported for new duty under Antigonus. He accepted their service. He thanked them. He sent private instructions, documented by Diodorus, but never made public at the time, to his satrap Saberchus in Arachosia, the region now known as Afghanistan. The Argoraspids were to be assigned to continuous frontier operations against mountain tribes, small unit engagements, never enough men to matter collectively, 2 or 3 at a time, sent forward until none remained. Their commander, Antigenes, was burned alive by Antigonus personally, cast into a pit of fire. The men who had crossed the Hindu Kush and outlasted the Gedrosian desert were assigned to disappear in the Afghan highlands. 2 or 3 deaths per frontier skirmish, engineered so that no sufficient number would ever again occupy the same ground at the same time. Not a battle, not a defeat, an administrative solution to a political problem. The 9th Legion, as we traced earlier, also vanished without a confirmed final location. 1 silence in Roman records, 1 absence in a provincial muster roll. The Argoraspids left something different, a documented process. Antigonus's method was written down. He did not bother to hide it because the men it was applied to were already too scattered to read it. Officially, frontier reassignment. Officially, routine deployment. Officially, nothing to note. Most accounts of Japanese covert warfare leave out the most important detail. The most feared intelligence operators of 15th century Japan were not deployed as assassins. They were deployed as pharmacists. The warriors of Koka Province, documented as a distinct system in the Bansen Shukai, a comprehensive manual compiled in 1676, were Zizmurai farmers in every visible respect, agricultural workers and tradespeople during daylight hours. They maintained shops, they treated illness, they traveled freely between villages in a country where strangers were watched with immediate suspicion. Their control over medicinal herb distribution across central Japan was not an incidental cover. It was the operational infrastructure. Moving as apothecaries between settlements, they mapped defensive structures during consultations, bribed gate guards with free treatment, and transported the chemical precursors for explosive compounds inside herb shipments. The saltpeter they required for powder was extracted from latrine deposits, a process requiring precise organic chemistry that they had refined over generations and shared with no one outside the system. In 1487, at the siege of Magari Castle, the Koka clans demonstrated what a decade of systematic intelligence penetration accomplished. A fortress calculated by its garrison to require months of siege fell in a fraction of that time. After the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan and absorbed the Iga clans, the Koka's regional rivals, formally into his security apparatus. His administrative records of that integration are extensive. The Koka clans appear in those records through 1600, and then their designation changes, merged into general policing functions. Their specific institutional identity dissolved into a bureaucratic category that covered everything and named nothing. The knowledge they held, the chemistry, the mapping systems, the pharmaceutical cover architecture, was not recorded in Tokugawa archives. It was not taught. It was not transferred. In 2021, a previously unknown Koka training manual was discovered in a shrine at Kuzuki, not described in any inventory, not copied, stored inside a sacred building for 400 years, in a category of space that no military archivist conducting a search would enter. The placement was deliberate. The location required specific knowledge of what would and would not be searched. The shogunate spent 2.5 centuries insisting it held a monopoly on organized violence. The manual in the shrine is a 400-year counter-argument. The knowledge survived the dissolution. Whether the dissolution was ever what the administrative record says it was, that is the question the manual raises without answering. I have been on enough cold cases to recognize the shape of a controlled withdrawal versus a genuine collapse. The manual was not misfiled. It was not forgotten. It was placed in a location that protected it specifically from the kind of search that would follow a state takeover of a rival institution. That decision required someone still operating inside the Koka system after the system was officially absorbed. The shogunate's records say the Koka clans merged into general policing. The shrine at Kuzuki says someone did not believe that merger was final. The last thing a Roman infantryman saw at the Battle of Singara in 344 of the Common Era was not a man. It was an iron wall that moved. The Sassanid cataphract, the word derives from the Greek kataphractos, meaning completely enclosed, represented the apex of individual weapons technology in the ancient world. Horse and rider were encased together in articulated scale armor from the crown of the helmet to the hooves. The rider carried a lance 2 meters in length. Ammianus Marcellinus, the most precise military historian of the late Roman period, wrote that this lance, the contos, was used to pin 2 infantrymen simultaneously in the same stroke. Their helmets incorporated iron face masks, not decorative, functional, designed to strip their opponents of the psychological comfort of finding a human face on the other side of the blade. They were engineered weapons with a human mechanism inside. The rock reliefs at Tak-e-Bostan in western Iran, datable to the Sassanid period, show a cataphract in full combat equipment. The combined weight of man and horse armor has been estimated by military historians at between 70 and 90 kilograms. Managing that weight in a battlefield charge required a conditioning program that began in childhood. The riders who performed at Singara had been training for 20 years before they first saw combat. The Sassanid military maintained formal schools. Tactical doctrine was written down in structured manuals. The training progressions, the formation geometry, the specific counter-maneuvers against Roman heavy infantry and steppe horse archery, all recorded, all teachable, all transferable to the next generation. When Justinian I concluded his campaigns against the Sassanids in the 6th century of the Common Era, he ordered the captured tactical manuals destroyed, not studied, not archived, not translated, destroyed. A century later, Emperor Maurice attempted to reconstruct Persian cavalry doctrine from fragmentary memory and veteran interview, producing the military treatise known as the Strategicon. Scholars at Princeton have noted that the Strategicon's cavalry sections read like a man filling in blanks he cannot see, a reconstruction from pieces of a document that no longer exists. Why did Justinian burn the source? The straightforward reading is religious and political. A Christian emperor had no interest in preserving the military theology of a Zoroastrian rival. The doctrine embedded in Sassanid manuals was not separable from its cultural framework. Destroying the framework was the point. But there is a second reading. A Roman army exposed to the full Sassanid training system would have seen, in detail, how a rival civilization trained men more effectively. That kind of institutional comparison generates pressure from below, soldiers asking why their own doctrine is inferior, officers requesting adjustments, administrators defending a status quo that has just been shown to be second best. Justinian had just concluded a war. He did not need questions about the quality of the system that won it. Both readings may be correct. Neither required a conspiracy. Bureaucratic convenience is usually sufficient explanation for the destruction of rival knowledge. What cannot be explained by convenience is the specific targeting of the manuals. Not the weapons, not the armor, not the infrastructure. The doctrine. The cataphracts are carved into the stone at Take Bostan. The system that produced them does not exist. Every cavalry doctrine that came after, Byzantine heavy horse, medieval knighthood, the armored systems of the Islamic expansion, was built on a partial reconstruction of what was once complete. Maurice's Strategicon is the attempt. The gaps in it are the evidence. The moon is down. The pass at Emmaus is dark and cold. Ahead, the Greek Macedonian force under the general Gorgias has positioned 40,000 soldiers to destroy a Judean rebel army that, by every rational calculation, should not have survived its first engagement. Gorgias has intelligence. He knows where the rebels are. He takes his best 5,000 troops and marches north in the darkness to eliminate them. He finds an empty camp, because the 600 men he is looking for moved through the hills 2 hours before his scouts arrived. They are already behind him. What Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer, as his followers called him, built in the Judean highlands between 167 and 142 before the Common Era, was not a guerrilla band. It was a tactical doctrine. The kind that military analysts at the United States Army Command and General Staff College have compared directly to documented asymmetric operations from the 20th and 21st centuries. Deception marches, exploitation of terrain that the professional enemy had not personally surveyed, systematic disruption of the opposing commander's intelligence cycle, not destroying information, but corrupting it, feeding the enemy a false picture until the moment the false picture became lethal. Civilian networks used as signal infrastructure. Women, children, farmers who passed messages in the language of daily commerce. Judas defeated an army of 40,000 at Emmaus. He did it again at Beth Zur. He did it again, with different terrain and different timing, at least twice more before the Seleucid Empire offered terms. The Book of Maccabees documents the campaign with a specificity unusual for religious literature. Dates, force compositions, movement timelines, logistical constraints. The detail is there because the people who wrote it were there. The Greek historian Polybius, writing contemporaneously, acknowledged the Seleucid defeats. He attributed them to administrative failures and supply problems. The specific battles, the movements that destroyed 3 separate professional armies, received no tactical analysis. Not in Polybius, not in Livy, not in any Greek or Roman military writer, who treated other engagements of the same period in granular detail. Greek military literature of the era analyzed every significant engagement involving new tactical approaches. The asymmetric victories of the Maccabees were not assigned to bad weather, or divine punishment, or Seleucid mismanagement, all of which appear as explanations in Greek accounts of other defeats. They were simply not assigned to anything. The mechanics of how 600 men defeated 40,000 were not recorded, not transmitted, not made available to the next commander facing the same problem. The tactics that broke the finest professional infantry of the Hellenistic world were excised from every military text in the ancient world. The knowledge of how to think smaller than the army you are facing, how to use terrain and time and an opponent's certainty against him, that knowledge was withheld, deliberately or through institutional negligence. Either answer is its own indictment. What eventually ended Maccabean independence was not a military defeat, it was assimilation. The dynasty the Maccabees founded gradually adopted the court practices of the Hellenistic states they had fought against. They hired mercenaries. They sought Roman recognition. The men who had outthought every professional force in the region became, within 3 generations, another palace government surrounded by inherited guards they did not trust. The tactics died with the urgency that had created them. Knowledge that has no institution to house it becomes a story, and stories get edited. Most people encounter the Maccabean history through Hanukkah, a festival of lights, a miracle of oil, 8 nights of candles. That story is real. It happened. But it happened after the battle. Before the miracle was the campaign, before the candles were the hills, before the 8 nights were the years. In those years, 600 people understood something about power that larger armies never have to learn. The most dangerous force in any conflict is not the stronger one. It is the one that controls the terms on which strength is measured. That knowledge was never written into a manual that survived. It was never passed to a school. It was never taught to the armies that came after. Whether that was deliberate or simply the cost of victory, of winning independence and then behaving like every power you defeated, the result is the same. The method died, the outcome survived. And in 2,000 years of military history, the lesson that 600 people demonstrated against 40,000 had to be rediscovered, repeatedly, by commanders who had never read a record of Emmaus because no such record was preserved for them to find. You have spent the last 20 minutes inside a pattern that official history calls coincidence. 10 elite forces, 10 moments when their power peaked, 10 silences that follow. The Templar fleet sails into darkness without a manifest. The 9th Legion's name drops from the military rolls without a dissolution order. The Argyraspids die 2 by 3 in mountain skirmishes, assigned to disappear by a general who documented the assignment. The tactics of the Maccabees are absent from every Greek military text that survived antiquity. This is not how history treats military failure. Failure gets analyzed. Failure gets cautionary chapters and explanatory footnotes. This is how history treats military success that became inconvenient, or military knowledge that the wrong people were not supposed to have. Most people walk through a museum exhibit on ancient armies, read the labels, and move to the next room. You stayed through 10 cases and noticed that the pattern doesn't change. Not in Persia, not in Rome, not in Egypt, not in Japan, not in medieval France. The erasure is not an accident of poor record keeping. Poor records look like silence. Deliberate erasure looks like clean silence. You know the difference now. Pick one of these 10. Tell me in the comments which erasure you think was systematic and which one might genuinely be accidental. Best documented argument gets pinned. Because I've gone through everything available on all of them, and I cannot find a single case where the silence was careless. Subscribe. And if you think this pattern is ancient, that states no longer manage the disappearance of forces that become inconvenient, the 3 cases I did not include in this video all have primary source discoveries from the last 15 years. The mechanism did not stop. The archives just got harder to access.